Well, good evening, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020, and tonight we are reading Part 9 of The War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. This chapter 14 is titled Rasse und Blut, Race and Blood. And so, want to welcome everyone here to the channel. I say Corky has to excuse himself tonight, but he's here 99% of the time. And thank you so much, Corky, for your great comments and assistance with the chat and everything else. Hello, David. How are you, man? Well, I don't know if the president is done speaking yet down in Georgia. I watched some of his speech and felt a little like I shouldn't, come on and conflict with the president, but come on now. The president has his audience. He's not going to miss me. Hey, Kathy Sue, glad you're here. Hooray for us all. And California is on lockdown again, those rats. I saw there was a sheriff of a county, Riverside County, that is refusing the governor's orders, Kathy. And I don't know where Riverside County is, but it sounds like a good idea, and it reminds me of a good old song, which is Down by the Riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Down by the riverside, I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield. Down by the riverside, and I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Yeah, let's sing that song together sometime. The next time we have a little get together. Riverside is where you grew up, but you wouldn't want to live there. Oh, that's sad. Well, anyway, I'm glad for the sheriff to be standing up to Newsom. Cheryl Thompson, thank you for being here. Glad you are here with us. And David, interesting drops on Twitter for the past couple days. Hard for me to keep up with you, David. I'm trying to do it, though. I think you're doing absolutely fabulous research, and everything you put up there is very important. Rasse und Blut. Negative eugenic solutions appeared in Germany at the end of the 19th century. Norman, hey man, you gotta stop. You're spending all your lunch money on on John. Wow, you got to see George today. I'm so happy for you, man. You've been looking forward to that. Well, anyway, thanks for the super chat, brother. From 1895 to 1900, German physician Gustav Bürters worked as a ship's doctor in the United States and traveled throughout the country. He learned of America's castrations, sterilizations, and numerous marriage restriction laws. When Bürters returned to Germany, he spent the next 3 decades writing newspaper articles, drafting proposed legislation, and clamoring to anyone who would listen to inaugurate eugenic sterilization. Constantly citing American precedents, from its state marriage restriction statutes to sterilization laws from Iowa to Oregon, Bürters passionately argued for Germany to follow suit. In a cultured nation of the first order, the United States of America, that which we strive toward, sterilization legislation, was introduced and tested long ago. It is all so clear and simple." Unquote. Eventually, Bertus became so fixated on the topic that he was considered delusional and was forced to retire from his post as a medical officer in Saxony, but not before prompting German authorities to seriously consider eugenic laws. While Bertus was touring America, so was German physician Alfred Plutz. A socialist thinker, Plutz had traveled to America, that's Ploetz, had traveled to America in the mid-1880s to investigate utopian societies. He became caught up in the post-Civil War American quest to breed better human beings. In Chicago, in 1884, he studied the writings of leading American utopians. He also spent several months working at the Icarian colony, Icarian, an obscure utopian community in Iowa. Plutz was disappointed to find the Icarians socially disorganized, and he began to believe that racial makeup was the key to social success. Plutz also opened a medical practice in Springfield, Massachusetts, and began to breed chickens. Later, he moved to Meriden, Connecticut, where he graduated to human breeding projects. By 1892, Plutz had already compiled 325 genealogies of local families and hoped to gather even more from a nearby secret German lodge. A nearby secret German lodge in Meriden, Connecticut? Isn't that interesting? David, see if you can find this lodge. I bet you can find it while we're talking. A colleague recalled that Plutz was convinced, quote, the Anglo-Saxons of America would be left behind unless they adopted a policy that would change the relative proportions of the population. Like his medical and utopian colleagues, Plutz was undoubtedly a devotee of the late 19th century's hygiene and sanitary movement that sought to eradicate germs and disease. One of the leading exponents of this movement was Benjamin Ward Richardson, inventor of the lethal chamber and author of Hygeia, a City of Health. The same conflicts that perplexed late 19th century British and American social Darwinists, from Spencer to New York's human breeding advocates, also confronted German hereditarians. By the mid-1880s, Plutz had propounded a eugenic racial theory. Galton's term eugenics had not yet been translated, and Plutz coined the term Rassenhygiene, racial hygiene. He articulated his notions of racial and social health in a multi-volume 1895 work, The Foundations of Racial Hygiene. Volume 1 was entitled Fitness of Our Race and the Protection of the Weak. His colleagues later argued that the term Rassenhygiene should not be translated into English as race hygiene, but as eugenics. The two were one and the same. Plutz believed that a better understanding of heredity could help the state identify and encourage the best specimens of the German race. Ironically, while Plutz believed in German national eugenics and harbored strong anti-Semitic sentiments, he included the Jews among Germany's most valuable biological assets. After returning to Germany, Plutz in 1904 helped found the journal Archiv für Rassen und Gesellschaftsbiologie, Archives of Race Science and Social Biology. And the next year, he organized the Society for Racial Hygiene to promote eugenic research. Both entities functioned as the principal clearinghouses for German eugenics for years to come. Understandably, Blut emerged as Germany's leading race theorist and was often described as, quote, the founder of eugenics as a science in Germany. Even as Blut and Blut were formulating their American-influenced ideas, German social theorist Alfred Jost argued in his 1895 booklet, quote, The Right to Death, that the state possessed the inherent right to kill the unfit and useless. The individual's right to die was not an issue. Rather, Jost postulated it was the state's inherent, quote, rights to inflict death that are the key to the fitness of life, unquote. The seeds of German negative eugenics were planted. With Nordic superiority as the centerpiece of American eugenics, Davenport quickly established good personal and professional relations with German race hygienists. As director of the Carnegie Institution's Station for Experimental Evolution, Davenport was more than happy to correspond frequently with German eugenic thinkers on matters major and mundane. In the first decade of the 20th century, typed and handwritten letters sailed back and forth across the Atlantic, encompassing requests for copies of the latest German research to replies to German appeals for Carnegie donations for a memorial to Mendel. Quickly, Davenport and the Carnegie Institution became the center of the eugenic world for German researchers. America was enacting a growing body of eugenic laws and governmental practices, and the movement enjoyed wealthy backers and the active support of U.S. officials. While a small group of German social thinkers merely expounded theory, America was taking action. At the same time, by virtue of their blond and blue-eyed Nordic nature, as well as their stellar scientific reputation, Germany's budding eugenicists became desirable allies for the Americans. A clear partnership emerged in the years before World War I. In this relationship, however, America was far and away the senior partner. In eugenics, the United States led, and Germany followed. One of Davenport's earliest German allies was the anthropologist and eugenicist Eugen Fischer. Fischer was among the first corresponding scientists recruited by Davenport when the Cold Spring Harbor facility opened in 1904. Before long, Davenport and Fischer were exchanging their latest research, including studies on eye color and hair quality. In 1908, Fischer expanded into research on race mixing between whites and Hottentots in Africa, focusing on the children known as, quote, Rehoboth bastards. Miscegnation fascinated Davenport. He and his colleagues, both German and American, jointly pursued studies on race mixing for years to come. When Davenport elevated eugenics into a global movement, he chose German eugenicists for a major role, and British leaders went along. Indeed, the first International Congress of Eugenics in London was scheduled for July of 1912 to coincide with summer visits to Great Britain by leading German and American eugenicists. At the time, these two groups were seen as the giants of eugenic science. But in fact, there was only room for one giant in the post-Galtonian world, and that would be America. When Blut founded the Society for Racial Hygiene in Berlin in 1905, it was little more than an outgrowth of his own social circle, and his publication, Archiv für Rassen und Gesellschaftsbiologie, was By the end of 1905, the society had just 18 German and 2 non-German members. Even when so-called branches opened in other German cities, these chapters usually claimed only a handful of members. The society was less than a national organization devoted to Germany's territorial borders than it was a German society devoted to the Nordic roots and Germanic language, innervating much of northwestern Europe. Blut himself maintained Swiss citizenship, as did some of his key colleagues. Thinking beyond Germany's borders, Blut expanded the group within a few years into the International Society for Race Hygiene. So-called branches were established in Norway and Sweden, but again, these branches were comprised of just a handful of eugenic compatriots. Pardon me. Yeah, I got like this, it must have been a half gallon of Mug brand root beer for 99 cents down at the store, and I guess it's pretty good. You know, that's cheaper than buying water. Get a half a gallon of root beer. Anyway, cheers. Hey everybody, it's good to have you all with me tonight. Saturday night show, the last show of my week, and tomorrow, a day off for me to be with my wife and do family things and catch up with stuff, you know. Really, a lot, a lot gets undone during the week since I'm doing these shows. I do a show in the morning and a show in the evening, and in between, I've been so into my research, just totally thrown into it, and I can't imagine doing anything else right now. It's just such a crucial time in our history. So great. I'm so glad you're with me. And isn't this fascinating to learn how the German eugenics program, which of course becomes the holiday, the Holocaust, how it was really just a branch of what was going on in Cold Spring Harbor and America. Hey, Kevin Timmer, glad to have you with us. Yeah, we have a small but elite group tonight on McDuff Channel. Thanks for being here. Neighborhood News Studio in Sarsaparilla. Yeah, that's one of the great drinks. Sarsaparilla from the Big Lebowski. Where's the money, Lebowski? As society members traveled through other traditionally Germanic and Nordic lands, however, they recruited more fellow travelers. By 1909, Plutz's growing international organization numbered more than 120 members, although most were German nationals. In the summer of that year, the organization gained prestige when Galton agreed to become its honorary president, just as he had for the budding Eugenics Education Society. 2 years later, in 1911, Plutz raised his group's profile again, this time by participating in the International Hygiene Exhibition in Dresden. But the Anglo-American bloc was clearly reluctant to see the German wing rise on the world eugenic stage. After a series of negotiations, the Anglo-American group for all intents and purposes absorbed Plutz's budding international network into the larger and better financed movement. Blut was brought in as lead vice president of the First International Congress of Eugenics in London in 1912. He was one of about 15 individuals invited back to Paris the next year to create the Permanent International Eugenics Committee. This new and elite panel evolved into the International Eugenics Commission and later became the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations, which governed the entire worldwide movement. After several failed attempts to regain leadership, Plutz and his societies finally bowed to American eugenicists and their international eugenics agencies. After 1913, the United States continued to dominate by virtue of its widespread legislative and bureaucratic progress, as well as its diverse research programs. These American developments were closely followed and popularized within the German scientific and eugenic establishment by Gese von Hoffmann, an Austro-Hungarian vice consul who traveled throughout the United States studying eugenic practices. Von Hoffmann's 1913 book, Racial Hygiene in the United States, exhaustively detailed American laws on sterilization and marriage restrictions, as well as methods of field investigation and data collection. With equal thoroughness, he delineated America's eugenic organizational structure, from the Rockefeller Foundation to the institutions at Cold Spring Harbor. Then, in alphabetical order, he summarized each state's eugenics legislation. A comprehensive 84-page bibliography was appended with special subsections for such topics as euthanasia and sterilization. A cheerful book, huh? Most importantly, von Hoffmann's comprehensive volume held up American eugenic theory and practice as the ideal for Germany to emulate. Galton's dream, he wrote, that racial hygiene should become the religion of the future, is being realized in America. America wants to breed a new superior race, unquote. That's just chilling to me. This is 1913, and the Germans are saying that America is going to breed the new superior race. Isn't that sad? Von Hoffmann repeatedly chided Germany for allowing mental defectives to roam freely, when in America such people were safely in institutions. Moreover, he urged Germany to follow America's example in erecting race-based immigration barriers. For years after Racial Hygiene in the United States was published, leading German eugenicists would credit von Hoffmann's book on America's race science as a seminal reference for German biology students. Laughlin and the Eugenics Record Office were the leading conduits of information for von Hoffmann. The ERO sent von Hoffmann its special bulletins and other informational summaries. In turn, von Hoffmann hoped to impress Laughlin with updates of his own. He faithfully reported the latest developments in Germany and Austria, such as the formation of a new eugenic research society in Leipzig, a nascent eugenic sexology study in Vienna, and genetic conference planning in Berlin. But it was the American developments that captivated von Hoffmann, continually impressed with Lauchlin's ideas. He frequently reported the latest American news in German medical and eugenic literature. I thank you sincerely, von Hoffmann wrote Laughlin in a typical letter dated May 26, 1914, for the transmission of your exhaustive and interesting reports. The far-reaching proposal of sterilizing 1/10 of the population impressed me very much. I wrote a review of the report in the Archiv für Rassen- und Gesellschaftsbiologie, that is the journal. Eager to be a voice for German eugenics in America, von Hoffmann also contributed articles about German developments to leading U.S. publications. In October of 1914, his article, Eugenics in Germany, appeared in the Journal of Heredity, explaining that while sterilization was being debated, the time has not yet come for such a measure in Germany. In the same issue, the Journal of Heredity published as an extensive review of Fischer's book about race crossing between Dutch and Hottentots in Africa, and the resulting, quote, Rehoboth bastard hybrids. Indeed, German eugenic philosophy and progress were popular in the Journal of Heredity. In 1914, for example, they published an article tracing the heredity of Bismarck, an article outlining plans for a new experimental genetics lab in Berlin, an announcement for the next International Genetics Conference in Berlin, and reviews of the latest German books. In the fall of 1914, the Great War erupted. During the war, the eugenics movement in Germany stood entirely still, as one of Germany's top eugenics leaders later remembered it. Blut withdrew to his estate. Sensational headlines in American newspapers reported and denounced German atrocities against civilians, such as bayoneting babies and mutilating women's breasts. Many of these stories were later found to be utterly unfounded, but despite the headlines, the American eugenics movement strengthened ties with its German scientific counterparts. In 1916, Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race declared that the white Nordic race was destined to rule the world, and confirmed the Aryan people's role in it. German nationalists were heartened by America's recognition of Nordic and Aryan racial superiority. Reviews of the book inspired a spectrum of German scientists and nationalists to think eugenically, even before the work was translated into German. American fascination with the struggling German eugenics movement continued right up to the United States' entry in the war in April of 1917. In fact, the April issue of Eugenical News summarized in detail von Hoffmann's latest article. It outlined Germany's broad plans to breed its own eugenically superior race after the war to replace German men lost on the battlefield. The article proposed special apartment buildings for desirable single Aryan women and cash payments for having babies. America entered the war on April 6, 1917. Millions died in battle. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, a defeated Germany finally agreed to an armistice, ending the bloody conflict. The Weimar Republic was created. A peace treaty was signed in June of 1919. America's eugenics partnership with the German movement resumed. Laughlin prepared a detailed pro-German speech for the 9th annual meeting of the Eugenic Research Association held at Cold Spring Harbor in June of 1920. In the text, Laughlin analyzed Germany's newly imposed democratic constitution, point by point, identifying the clauses that authorized eugenic and racial laws. These included a wide range of state powers, from Article 7, allowing protection of plants from disease and pests, to Articles 119 to 134 inclusive, which prescribe the fundamental law of Germany in reference to social life. Declaring that modern civilization itself depended on German and Teutonic conquest. Imagine that. This is an American, right? Laughlin closed by assuring his colleagues, quote, "From what the world knows of Germanic traits, we logically concede that she will live up to her instincts of race conservation." Lachlan never actually delivered the speech, probably because of time constraints, so Eugenical News published it in their next issue. Scientific correspondence also resumed shortly after Lachlan's enthusiastic appraisal, a eugenicist at the Institute for Heredity Research in Potsdam researched ERO documentation for his advisory committee's presentation to the local government. Davenport dispatched materials and supporting statements, quote, that will be of use to you in your capacity as advisor to the government in matters of race hygiene, unquote. ERO staffers had missed their exchanges with German colleagues, and Davenport assured his Potsdam friend, quote, I read your letter to our staff at its meeting on Monday, and they were interested to hear from you. Information about the new advisory committee was published in the very next issue of Eugenical News. German race scientists reciprocated by sending their own research papers for Davenport's review, covering a gamut of topics from inherited human traits to mammalian attributes. But efforts by German eugenicists to join America's international movement were still hampered by aftershocks of the war. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany agreed to pay the Allies massive war reparations, 132 billion marks, or $33 billion. This crippled the finances of all of Germany, including its raceologists. Meanwhile, German nationalists were enraged because France and Belgium now occupied the Rhineland. France's army had long included African soldiers from its colonies, such as Senegal, Mali, and North Africa, who were now mingling with German women and would ultimately father several hundred children of mixed race in Germany. Infuriated, Germans refused to cooperate with international committees that included Belgium or French scientists. Nor did they have the money to travel, even within Europe. The International Congress of Hygiene, for instance, originally scheduled for May of 1921 in Geneva, was canceled because the low value of the currency of many countries and the high value of the Swiss franc made it impossible for many countries to send delegates, as one published notice explained. Hence, German scientists were unable to and unwilling to attend the Second International Congress of Eugenics in New York in September of 1921. Instead, they sent bitter protest letters to Cold Spring Harbor, denouncing the French and Belgian occupation of their land and seeking moral support from colleagues in America. Indeed, even though invitations to the Congress were mailed to eugenicists around the world by the State Department, the Germans were excluded due to escalating post-war diplomatic and military tensions. 3 weeks before the Second Congress, Davenport wrote to one prominent Berlin colleague, Agnes Blum, quote, profound regrets that international complications have prevented formal invitations to the International Eugenics Congress in New York City, unquote. He added his hope that by the time of the following Congress, such complications will have been long removed. So, once again, American science took center stage in international eugenics. Alienated from much of the European movement, Germany's involvement in the field was now mainly limited to correspondence with Cold Spring Harbor. Germany's scientific, quote-unquote, eugenics community was getting its main information from Cold Spring Harbor. Let that resonate. Well, this is a fairly long chapter, and I think I'm going to kind of cut it in half tonight here at 8:38 p.m. and let it sit where it is here on page 268 in the chapter called Rasse und Blut, Race and Blood. And we're studying the development of the racial superiority theories that came out of the British eugenics and then American eugenics, and then the American grew to the biggest program incorporating the British, and then the Germans have their own program. The German program, on hold during World War I, is revived after the war, but due to political and economic tensions, is basically isolated from other European programs, with the exception that it is very much in touch with Davenport at Cold Spring Harbor in New York, of course. So let's leave it there for tonight and really let it sink in that the idea of the master race, unfortunately, is an American idea. You know what? I will take this question from Art and Yoga since we're sitting here. Why the focus on eugenics? How does it apply today? Good question. No problem. I'm glad you're here, Art and Yoga, and you've been with me a long time, and I appreciate your presence. So, why am I focusing on eugenics? Well, because we are now facing a very powerful movement for depopulation, depop, okay? The idea that was popularized after World War II by books like The Population Bomb by, what's his name, Ehrlich, and so much of the propaganda that we Americans have been fed about how, the population is growing too fast for the food supply, and that's the justification for all the Rockefeller GMO food programs and, destroying natural agricultural practices in favor of commercial with chemical and biological applications. The entire justification for which is overpopulation. Overpopulation is the new, after World War II, version of eugenics. So we've got too many people, we've got too many defective people, we've got defective races, that blood is getting mixed in with the good races, and we have got to do something about it. And that became John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s mission in life. You can study that. You can just listen to James Corbett, who talks about this in great detail. The Green Revolution, all of these Rockefeller-based projects and Ford Foundation-based projects that are really bankers' ways of taking over our world, our food supply, our everything. Let's just say the banks are gradually getting their fingers into every single bit of resources or value of any kind on planet Earth. And to control it and to control us, they have to have us with limited population and limited life expectancy. And this is where I think these vaccines may be headed. You understand, right, that vaccines up to now have meant injecting you with a little bit of the disease that you are vaccinating against that will then create the antibodies in your immune system so that when the disease actually hits town, you'll be ready and it won't make you sick because you've got the antibodies. That's the way vaccines have always been taught. But the idea of these mRNA vaccines, as far as I can tell, it doesn't have the virus in it. It's a different technique. Well, what is it? What are they doing? Are they putting in scientifically designed gene splicing to Well, make us immune from any type of a cold, any type of a virus. I won't even mention the specific one because it's not necessary. You know what I'm talking about. Why? If this vaccine, if there's a vaccine coming, it doesn't even have the virus in it. So what is the mechanism? How does it work? Explain that to me before you start pulling needles out and asking me to bend over. So I hope that makes it simple. We do not want to be GMO'd people. You put it very well. And we do not want to have our loved ones euthanized just because in some bureaucrat's judgment they're no longer useful to society. Well, everybody, have a great rest of the weekend. I'm very grateful for your support. Thanks for supporting my Patreon. Got some new Patreon members, and thanks for joining. But mainly, I really think it's most important right now that we support George Webb on his Patreon. If you got an extra $5, send it to him. I think it would help cheer him up. He's doing fine, but you can tell anybody would feel a little bit under attack from the fact that he's been under attack and taking down all of his work. Well, you know what it feels like if you've worked on something and then somebody just takes it away. You built your sandcastle and some other kid comes along and kicks it, right? So, yes, Kathy Sue, that's right. Dr. Mary's Monkey, and it's one of the most important books of the 20th century for me, or the 21st century, I guess. And Ed Haslam was a great gentleman, showed me all around the Judy Very Baker territory, and those videos exist. I'll try to republish them as I have time, and I'm working on a plan to get everything back up, so hang in there. All the old videos, the old books, they will be back, and McDuff Channel will survive. Talk to you soon. Have a great weekend.